Hello Flight Sim fans, this is Afterburner's Flight Sim channel. Before this year 2017 comes to an end, I have decided to make a new video about Prepared, which will hopefully give you some insights and improve your experience with that simulator. The title of today's video is gonna be FPS Limiter and Fiber Frame Time Fraction. Let's briefly talk about the first one. Limiting your frames per second in the simulator using the menu is something that some of you do and some of you don't. Whatever your stance is on limiting frames, this is something that definitely makes sense, especially if you want to achieve smoothness. In that case, it's important that the frame rate matches the refresh rate of your screen, or that the refresh rate is a multiple of the frame rate set in the simulator. Because if you run at unlimited frame rates, it's common to see huge jumps in FPS during your flight, and these jumps are the prime cause for stutters. Something that most of you surely do not welcome. And the second term of my video, Fiber Frame Time Fraction, that's a tweak that you cannot find in the menu. You have to dig into your prepared configuration file and add it manually there. I will show you how a little bit later. And to the experts among you, the Fiber Frame Time Fraction tweak is probably well known. It is documented in the internet. And to the newbies of the prepared flight simulation scene, that tweak determines basically the share of the CPU resources devoted to scenery and autogen building. That's the simple definition. The official definition by Lockheed Martin I will show you later, but for now, let's just say that this tweak determines how many resources are devoted to the scenery and autogen buildup. Why do I mention this tweak in relation with FPS Limiter? Because this is something that is interrelated. You will probably not like the relationship, which I will document in a little bit, and this is why it's important that you know about the effect of that tweak on your frame rate and on the scenery quality. So in a little bit, I'm gonna fire up the simulator and start documenting what that tweak does in conjunction with limiting your frame rates or not. So stay tuned. I'm gonna start with the prepared configuration file that is untweaked, and if it's untweaked, the default value for fiber frame time fraction is assumed to be 0.33. So let's go ahead and start the simulator. Right now I am at KLAX, Los Angeles International Airport, using the default Cessna of Flight Simulator X, and the simulator date is December 23rd, 12:31 p.m. and you can see the frame rate at the upper left, which doesn't look high, I admit. It's fluctuating currently between 22 and 23 with an unlimited setting, and while the value may not be very high, you have to look at my settings. I have dialed up most settings, for example scenery complexity, which I have set to extremely dense, the maximum, and then autogen is very dense, and I also have a lot of traffic. And you should also know that I'm using Orbix Southern California, and to those of you who use that scenery, you're probably familiar with the resource consumption of that scenery, so it's quite a huge resource hog. And if I take a look at the traffic toolbox, which is a tool that monitors the amount of AI traffic generated, we have currently 312 airplanes processed, which is a lot for that scenery. So if you look at the airport from the top, you see almost all gates and all parking spaces occupied by AI traffic. Now, let's focus on the frame rate. So as I said, while the current value may not be very high from an absolute perspective, but it is relatively good given the settings and the orbit scenery. If now, without having tweaked your prepared configuration file, you limit your frame rate to a value that is higher than you had before the limit. So remember, I had 22, 23, 24, and let's limit the frame rate to 60 and see what happens. Well, for some reason, we suddenly got a drop in frame rate, which is quite dramatic, I would say. I mean, a drop from 23 down to 15 is almost, well, it's not a 50% drop, but if you compare the current frame rate with the one that we had before, you had a 50% increase with unlimited. So again, we have currently 15, and if I remove the FPS limiter, I get back to 22, 23. And this is obviously something where you think, what the heck, what's happening? And apparently it looks like Prepared processes the whole frame thing differently if you limit the frame rate. And by the way, this is not something that is exclusive to Prepared. This also occurred with FSX and the previous Prepared version. So there is something that obviously must be going wrong, and I don't have the knowledge to actually tell you exactly what is going on, that the frame rate drops so much even though the frame limit that you apply is still way above what you got before you applied the limit. And the only thing that you can do now is to apply the fiber frame time fraction tweak to get rid of the dramatic drop in frame rate. So let's see what happens if I apply that tweak. If you want to add the fiber frame time fraction tweak, you have to open your prepared configuration file and seek the section main. So let's scroll and take a close look. Okay, so here it is, the section main, and you can just copy and paste from the prepared learning center. 0.33, as I said before, that's the default value. Okay, and let's look at the definition of this tweak. According to the learning center, this setting, which defaults to a value of 0.33 or 33%, defines the percentage of each frame that is devoted to loading scenery. So my previous definition, when I said that it determines the amount of resources spent by the CPU on scenery loading, I think that definition comes relatively close to the one written in the learning center. Okay, with 0.33 we had quite a dramatic drop in frame rate. Let's try a value of 0.10. Here we are again at KLAX, runway 0.6 left. And as you can see, the unlimited frame rate is identical to the scenario before, but if I limit the frame rate, you can see that the drop is not quite as dramatic. Previously, without the tweak, the frame rate dropped down to 15, but now it dropped only to the upper 20s, which is obviously a lot better than we had before. But still, there's a slight difference between limited and unlimited frame rate. Although, if you have a scenery as complex as this, the difference is not as big as if you had less complex scenery, where you might see drops from, let's say, 50 to 44. Now, logic tells us that if you continue decreasing the FFTF value, you must get a limited frame rate that matches more and more closely the unlimited value. Let's see if that's true by entering an FFTF value of 0.01. And now I'm going to change the value of fiber frame time fraction from 0.1 to 0.01 and see what that does to the difference between limited and unlimited frame rate. I'm gonna save the file and open the simulator. And while it's starting, let me mention that back when this tweak was discovered for the first time during FSX times, some people recommended that you could set the value down to 0 to maximize the frame rate. However, it was later found that if you do so, you will get very slow or no scenery loading at all. So don't set the value to 0. And while the scenario is loading, let me also mention that, as you can see, I'm still using prepared version 3. I bet that the majority of you viewers use version 4 these days. However, since the difference between limited and unlimited frame rate without the tweak has been identical with FSX and then in prepared version 1, version 2, and then version 3, I assume that it's no different with version 4. However, since I do not use version 4, I cannot guarantee that it's still the same. You're welcome to test that on your system and let me know in the comment section. However, given the previous history, I'm relatively confident that the behavior is still the same in version 4 as in version 3. So we're back, identical scenario, identical frame rate, and if we limit it, you can see that now there's no frame rate drop at all between unlimited and limited frame rate. Well, that's certainly a good thing, and you might conclude at this point that the problem is solved, right? Just set your FFTF value to 0.01 and you're good to go to enjoy highest possible frame rates on your destination airport without the nasty performance drop that I've just documented. Well, if things were so simple. Let's take another look at the explanation of the fiber frame time fraction tweak in the Learning Center. It mentions, among other things, increasing this number can reduce the blurries. Well, that's nice, but if you think about it for a few seconds, that leaves one to conclude or to infer that decreasing this number should worsen the blurries or increase them. Well, that's no good news, certainly. And in the following, I will show you how much the blurries or the scenery will be suffering under low FFTF values. This is a replay of a video that I made on a test flight from Palm Springs in California to Los Angeles International Airport with the Learjet from Flight Simulator X. That's using an FFTF value of 0.01 and limiting the frame rate to 30. And as you can see, on approach to Los Angeles International Airport runway 24 right, the autogen objects load pretty late and there are also noticeable blurries down below. So it looks like the information that increasing the FFTF value can reduce the blurries means that reducing that value induces blurries, which is not a good thing, as you can see. Well, the frame rate doesn't look bad, 26, 24, that's quite good, given that the scenery is from Orbix, which is notorious for high VAS consumption and low frame rates, but it comes at a price. And as you see in front of you, some miles away, there is no scenery visible at all, except of the textures, which don't seem very sharp. The only exception is the local scenery, that you can generate from setting your scenery complexity slider, but as far as autogen, there is no autogen in front of you, sadly. Now, let me say that you won't always see it that extreme as in this video. Why? Because in my video I have used a very complex scenery, Orbix Southern California. However, if you use the default prepared scenery or even Orbix Global, Orbix OpenLC and Orbix Vector without approaching a big international airport, your blurries or lack of autogen might not be as extreme as you see here. So keep that in mind. If your scenery is less complex than what you see here, you won't get as bad of blurries as you see here. Let me jump a little bit forward so that we're gonna get closer to the airport. We're now 11.5 miles away. Nautical miles, I should say. And you see the airport and the buildings at the airport, but as I said, no autogen objects. And what you see here, well, this is one thing that is annoying with the default ATC, that if you are on approach, the controller is not aware of any traffic that is approaching the runway as well. So I think I should say no more. The result is visible. If you use a fiber frame time fraction value of 0.01, your scenery loading is gonna suffer if you fly over very complex areas. Let's compare that with a value of 0.33, which is the default value. In this test flight, I had the fiber frame time fraction tweak deleted, and I limited the frame rate to 30 frames per second as in the previous video. Here, you can see quite clearly that you have all autogen objects in front of you and to the side, and you can also see that the texture quality is very crisp. So if you do not use the fiber frame time fraction tweak, you will get your autogen objects and the textures will look very sharp regardless of whether the scenery that you fly above is complex or not. However, that comes at a hefty price for the frame rate, because as you see, now the frame rate is much lower than in the previous test video. Previously, you remember we had a value of roughly 16, 17, maybe a little higher, a little lower, but now as you approach the final nautical miles to the airport, your frame rate tanks down to 11, 12, 13, and well, there is no free lunch. That's something that does not hold true in economics. It also is true when it comes to CPU power. If you increase your FFTF value or don't use it at all, and the default value, as I said, is 0.33, You will get sharp scenery, you will get a massive amount of autogen objects, but your frame rate will suffer. So, to me personally, I think that's a little too far in the direction of sharpness at the expense of frame rate. And for comparison, I'm gonna show you how the scenery and the frame rates behave if you use unlimited frame rates and if you do not apply the fiber frame time fraction tweak. If you use unlimited frame rates without the FFTF tweak, I would say that you get something in the middle. You get slightly higher frame rate than when you limit the frame rate. However, as you have seen just 1-2 seconds ago, the crispiness of the texture might not be 100% sharp at some spots. However, don't forget that if you start from an airport and you do not limit your frame rate, you will achieve the maximum possible performance. So if you run unlimited frame rate, I've experienced that on the one hand you will maximize your frame rate at the destination airport, and if you approach the final airport over a complex scenery, you will get all of the autogen objects generated, but the texture sharpness might not always be as good as with frame rates limited and a value of 0.33. Let me say that this is with the Intel CPU i5-4690K, no overclocking in turbo mode. However, if you use a CPU that has more cores, I do not know if that is gonna have an impact on the relationship between unlimited frame rate and limited frame rate. And as you see, the frame rate is higher than when we limited the frame rate, but it's on the other hand, it's lower than when you use the value of 0.01. Well, that makes sense because with so many objects generated, you will obviously face a hit in FPS. What you see creates somewhat of a dilemma to those who limit their frame rates in the simulator, because if you do not apply the fiber frame time fraction tweak, you will have a hefty drop in frame rate at your departure airport and also a considerable drop at the destination airport. On the other hand, if you want to get rid of the frame rate drop at the departure airport, you have to accept a lot of blurries as you arrive at the destination airport. You might want to try with some values between 0.33 and 0.01. In this video I have used the value of 0.05, and with that value the drop in frame rate at the departure airport is minuscule. But if you are on approach over a complex scenery, you see the scenery being loaded late and in patches. You know, that's in reference to the thread in the Prepared forum about users who complained that in Prepared version 3 that the extended autogen is being loaded late and in patches. And the same thing happens if you set a value of 0.05, and well, I will let you be the judge. It creates a few autogen objects in front of you, but the popping is obviously a little annoying. So using a value of 0.05, again, if the scenery that you're flying above is not complex, you will have no problems at all. But if you use a scenery like Orbix, Southern California, or other areas, you will definitely face a deterioration of scenery quality. If you find yourself in a situation where the loading of autogen and textures becomes very lagged and you want to accelerate the loading, there are two options. And these options work regardless of what value you set in your prepared configuration file. You can either press the pause button. If you do that, you will see the objects being loaded quite quickly. Now, right now, I'm not using the simulator live. I'm just in the pause mode of the video that I made of the test flight. Or you can reduce your frame rate to a value that is lower than what you get when you set the value higher than in the unlimited situation. For example, right now I have roughly 20 frames per second, fluctuating between 16 and 20. The target frame rate is set to 30, so the target frame rate is higher than what I get. If you set it to 20 precisely, you will see that the loading does not really speed up, and that's because the frame rate that you had before and that you have now with the limit at 20 does not differentiate. So the CPU does not have more resources to process the scenery and autogen loading. But now if you set the frame rate limit to a value that's lower than before, to 15, now the CPU has more resources to load the objects. And just wait for a little bit and you will see that the loading of the trees and the houses occurs much more quickly than before. So again, if you have set your fiber frame time fraction value low and you are in a situation where the lack of autogen or the blurries are no longer acceptable to you, you can either press the pause button or artificially limit your frame rate to a value that is lower to force the CPU to spend the surplus of its resources to load the scenery. And of course, I agree that having a frame rate of 15 does not make a joy to arrive at this airport, but as I said, there is a trade-off, and it's up to you to decide what you want, either high frame rate at the expense of blurries or vice versa. Here's a statement that I have seen in flight simulation forums from times to times, that setting different values for fiber frame time fraction has no effect if you run the simulator at unlimited frame rate. And this statement might have been inferred from the fact that setting different values for FFTF does not have any effect on the frame rate initially after you load the simulator, but that statement as a whole is false, because yes, it's true that the initial frame rate is not affected by different values as you have seen in my demonstrations. However, setting the value too low does have an effect on blurries or scenery, even if you run the simulator at unlimited frame rate. Let me show you. In this video, I let the simulator run at unlimited frames, and the FFTF value was set to 0.01. And as you can see, you have a situation that's identical to where you did use the frame limiter with value of 0.01. You have no autogen objects in front of you, and the textures are not sharp. So the blurries are all around you, and I would say it's even a little worse than if you limit your frame rate. Well, at least you can still see the automobiles and the trucks on the highways, but that's not gonna give you much of an enjoyment on the approach. And let's suppose that you are in a situation like this and you want to speed up the loading. As I said before, another option is to press the pause button. I did it somewhere in this video. Let me jump a little bit forward. Okay, so I did press the pause button, and let's wait for a few seconds. You will be able to see live how the textures increase their sharpness. So you've seen the blurries in this area, and I would say quite noticeable blurries. And if you press the pause button and wait a little bit, the blurries suddenly start to disappear and your textures will start to look crispier. And on the question how much time you need to wait until the objects and the textures are loaded, that depends on the complexity of the scenery. So as soon as the textures are loaded, well, if you want to speed up the loading even further, you want to limit your frame rate down to a low value deliberately to give the CPU more resources, and you'll see that the loading of objects will start immediately and swiftly. So as a quick tool, you can press the pause button and limit your target frame rate to a low value to speed up the build-up of all objects and textures. If you leave the frame rate at unlimited and you press the pause button, as you have seen, the textures will get loaded quickly, but the autogen objects did not load up yet. So I don't know how much longer you would need to wait. So in my case, I didn't want to wait much longer. I just limited the frame rate to a low value and then returned back to unlimited as soon as the loading was complete. But be wary of this method, because if you go back to unlimited and you continue flying, the loading of scenery will of course not be as quick, because now you are no longer in pause mode and you have set your frames to unlimited, so the CPU will try to maintain a higher frame rate at the expense of scenery loading. And well, we have now passed a few nautical miles before landing at the airport, and you see that the loading occurs slowly. And I would say that when the loading is so slow, it might be even better to have no loading at all, but with improved frame rate. So remember, having a low fiber frame time fraction setting does have an impact if you fly with unlimited frame rates. At the end, you might want to know what to conclude from the findings. If you don't use the frame rate limiter, if you run the simulator at unlimited frames, there is not much to worry about. But if you do use the frame rate limiter, you've seen that doing that without the fiber frame time fraction tweak will make your frame rate suffer tremendously, depending on the situation and whether the achieved frame rate is higher or lower than the limit set in the menu. For example, if you have an unlimited frame rate at 60 or 64 and you limit your frame rate to 30, you might achieve easily 30 frames per second. The drop in frame rates comes into play when the unlimited frame rate is low to begin with. In that case, the drop will push your FPS even lower. Now, if you want to avoid the drop in frame rate at the destination airport or at the initial scenario, you need to reduce your FFTF setting, but as you've seen in the video, that will induce blurries depending on the complexity of the scenery. And let me also say that if you do not apply the FFTF tweak, you will get a drop in frame rate in all situations, at the destination airport, during flight, and initially at the departure airport. When it comes to the departure airport or to the situation initially after loading the sim, there's apparently no visual difference between running the frames and unlimited. And this is why the phenomenon is quite nasty. Overall, I would say this is a dilemma, and unfortunately there is no one-size-fits-all FFTF setting, so you have to decide what's best for you. And as I have shown you in the video, if you happen to experience a situation where the blurries are unacceptable and you see no autogen objects, then you might want to reduce your frame rate to a value lower than you had before, or to do it in combination with pressing the pause button. And as I mentioned in the video, what you have seen during my tests is a little extreme, and I would say this, the way that you have seen is only apparent if you fly over scenery that is very complex. And Orbic Southern California is one of the most complex scenery that you can find in the market for prepared. If you do not use a complex scenery like this, you might not even encounter blurries or a lack of autogen loading. Sometimes I do perform flights over Orbic's OpenLC in either Europe or North America, and for most of the times, I personally do not experience blurries, even though I do set the value sometimes to 0.01. And also know that if you use a slower CPU, obviously the scenery will not get as many resources to make it load and sharp, so slower processors need higher FFTF values to ensure that the textures are crisp and the autogen objects all loaded. And let's see. Okay, I also wanted to mention that in some situations it might actually be desirable to have no autogen objects or just a few of them on your approach, especially if you fly some tube liners such as PMDG 737, 777 or Concorde X and other complex airliners, because these airliners dearly need CPU power. And some of you might say, okay, I don't worry about the lack of autogen outside, I'm just focused on the instruments and on performing a smooth and picture book landing at the airport. And that's a situation where you might favor higher frame rate over crisp textures and having the presence of all autogen objects. So this tweak does not have to be interpreted negatively. In some situations, you might want to use it if you deliberately want to achieve the highest possible frame rate, if you don't care about the scenery quality. And it should not come as a surprise that using different FFTF settings does have an impact on your virtual address space value, although that's something that users of prepared version 4 do no longer have to worry about, since version 4 is 64-bit sim. To people like me who still use prepared version 3, you also might want to take a look at the VAS profile during the flight. All the flights that I've shown you in the video were made from Palm Springs, California, to Los Angeles International Airport using Orbix South California. And as you see, that add-on is quite VAS hog. I started at just over 2000 megabyte, and then the load of VAS progressively increased up to 3600. That's without limiting your frames and without adding the FFTF tweak to your prepared configuration file. If you limit the FFTF value, you will see that the VAS consumption will be lower, and that's another aspect for those who fly heavy tube liners, because those airplanes alone use a lot of VAS, so you don't want to have any additional VAS load produced by the scenery. And this is where reducing the setting, the value, might benefit your VAS consumption. Again, that's if you use version 3 or earlier. And if you use the default value for FFTF, and if you limit your frames, by the way, the frames were limited here. Now, if you use the default value, the consumption will be even higher than with unlimited. Just to compare, this is unlimited in default fiber frame, and this is limited frames. So because the textures are even sharper than with unlimited, you will obviously see higher consumption in VAS. Okay, I hope that now you have a better understanding of the interaction between the FPS limiter and the fiber frame time fraction tweak. So that's something that, unfortunately, I'm afraid you cannot escape, because if you say, oh, I don't want to know anything about the FFTF value or tweak, and you limit your FPS, well, you will be punished by a low frame rate. And in order to find your best compromise, you have to play around and find a value where you can say, okay, I have the best compromise between frame rate and crispiness of the scenery. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen, and I will see you in the next video.